For 2 decades, Fred and Rose West escaped justice. And by the early 90s, their ordinary family house had become a killing factory. They'd claimed the lives of at least 12 girls and young women.
Behind this facade of normality, they were murdering people for years and years and years.
That horror was about to be revealed on an unprecedented scale.
It's still one of the biggest cases the UK has had.
Body after body was recovered, but no one knew who the victims were.
This is a huge task.
1, 2, 3,
to
4,
put one
5,
set
6,
of
7, 8,
bones
9, 10.
to an actual being.
The West's own children were among the victims.
People say, how do you feel about the victims' families? Or, hello, it's nice to meet you. Because I am one of the victims' families.
But the most prolific and sadistic serial killing partnership in Britain was about to end in treachery and betrayal.
She's as wicked as he is. They were both as bad as one another, and I, for one, just hope she rots in hell.
When police knocked at the door of 25 Cromwell Street in Gloucester on the 6th of August 1992, it wasn't murder they were investigating, but child abuse. A short time earlier, a 13-year-old girl had told a friend Fred had raped her.
It was filmed.
He filmed it.
The friend had told an officer who patrolled the beat near her home.
No, come on, we have to tell someone. We have to tell the police.
Don't.
When police arrived, the West's 5 youngest children, aged 9 to 15, were all in the house. Fred appeared unfazed, but Rose immediately reacted to the threat of exposure.
Straight away, the younger children were all taken into care, and Rose's life did start to fall apart.
She reacted so violently, she had to be restrained. But Fred was well used to brushes with the law after decades of petty crime. He left Cromwell Street and went to work as a builder as usual. At the house, officers began their search.
Police find and seize a great deal of evidence, and that includes bondage equipment, whips, all sorts of odd sexual implements, and also a huge quantity of pornography involving bondage, sadomasochism, cannibalism, incest, you name it. This is the full range of sexual perversion.
Police seized 99 VHSs, some featuring Rose filmed by Fred as she worked as a prostitute, plus some photographs showing the West children naked. But officers found no video of the 13-year-old who said she'd been raped. Rose was arrested and briefly held by police for aiding and abetting Fred to have sex with an underage girl, child cruelty, and obstructing officers. Police then went to the builder's yard where Fred was working.
Fred West?
Yeah?
I'm arresting you under charges of sexual abuse. Anything you say will be taken down.
He was taken in for questioning.
Come with us.
Howard Ogden, the duty solicitor brought in to represent Fred, found him surprisingly upbeat.
The earliest recollections of Fred are of this quite jovial chap who was obviously quite outgoing, who worked hard, and he was just an ordinary bloke.
But as police questioned Fred about the child abuse, a much darker side of his character emerged.
It was a father's duty, as he would put it, to break in his daughters.
You don't know where the bastard's doing it, do you?
He appeared to think that was normal, and he couldn't understand why I or anybody else might think that was unusual or unacceptable.
Leading the interrogation was Detective Constable Hazel Savage.
Hazel Savage had been a detective for many years. She was acknowledged as an excellent investigator.
She'd been aware of Fred's activities in a general sense, but now she's part of an investigation to child abuse, sexual child abuse at the house. And so this brings her squarely into contact with Fred and Rose, and this is a very significant development.
Hazel had come across Fred West 25 years earlier. In 1966, then still in uniform, she'd been sent to Scotland to question Fred's first wife, Rena, in a theft case.
Rena had painted a very unflattering portrait of Fred as a man who was promiscuous, violent, possibly dangerous, somebody whom she was worried about having custody of her children.
He's not right in the head. I think he's probably mad.
Rena had told Hazel she had 2 daughters. Charmaine was the child of a bus driver. Since Rena had split with Fred in 1969, she'd left both girls with Fred and Rose. After the interrogation, Fred was sent on remand to Gloucester prison for the rape of the 13-year-old girl. Rose was allowed home. But Hazel wanted to talk to Rena's daughter, Anne-Marie, now 28 years old and living in Gloucester. Rose knew Anne-Marie could reveal secrets that would prove catastrophic. Seconds before Hazel arrived at Anne-Marie's door, Rose rang her daughter and begged her not to talk to police.
This must have been a huge decision for Anne-Marie to break years of silence, the code of silence of the West, you know, don't say anything. Everything that happens at Cromwell Street happens in secret.
Do you see Hazel Savage?
Yeah, I know you are. Come in.
For the first time, the depravity of life at Cromwell Street was about to be laid bare.
It's a lie. I tell you, when I get my hands on Fred, he's a dead man.
After more than 20 years of rape, torture and murder, Fred and Rose were about to be exposed. One of their first victims was Fred's 8-year-old daughter, Anne-Marie. She had finally agreed to talk to Detective Constable Hazel Savage of Gloucestershire Police.
A lot had been bottled up. Basically, Anne-Marie had kept things back.
I was 8.
Anne-Marie bravely revealed years of physical, mental and sexual abuse by both Fred and Rose, and other men they forced her to have sex with.
Anne-Marie was tied up, implements were used, and she was raped repeatedly as a young girl in Cromwell Street.
And her interview also revealed the manipulative power of the abuse by Fred and Rose.
Curious thing is that she was quite forgiving, very forgiving in the circumstances, that Fred was still a dad.
When somebody is being abused by someone known to them who has the role as caretaker and to look after them, the focus for the victim is on surviving and to attach themselves to the person who's hurting them. This is a form of Stockholm syndrome.
Anne-Marie talked about her mother, Rena, and half-sister, Charmaine.
Have you got a number? No.
I don't know where either of them are.
It was natural for Hazel Savage to ask Anne-Marie where Charmaine was, where Rena was, and the bottom line is Anne-Marie didn't know.
Hazel also asked her about her half-sister Heather, Fred and Rose's daughter, born 6 years after Anne-Marie.
Your dad or Rose ever said where Heather went?
Rose said that she was working in a holiday camp.
Did they say what camp it was?
I don't know, she just disappeared.
Heather hadn't been seen since 1987, age 16. Hazel's suspicions deepened.
Have you checked each year?
Hazel makes various checks.
Right.
She finds that there is no trace of Heather travelling on a passport, paying income tax, or having any kind of medical or dental work done on the NHS in all these years. Now, that's virtually impossible. Unless A, you've changed your identity completely, B, you've gone to live in a foreign country, or C, you're dead.
Hazel decided to pull Rose in for questioning.
She was quite agitated at being at a police station and asking what on earth all this was about. It was as though this was an unwanted and unnecessary interruption in her life.
Is this a long conversation?
It's certainly an important conversation.
Well, I've got a job to go to, and that's important. And I've got food to prepare and kids to look after.
I appreciate that, Mrs. West.
I haven't got time to spend in a cell.
Hazel asked Rose where Heather was. What Rose said in interview would later form key evidence at her trial.
Told me she was going to go, and I said, please don't do so. We've got more to talk about. But I went shopping, and I was gone for 2 hours, as per usual. And when I got back, she'd gone. If my child don't want anything to do with me, there's nothing I can do about it.
She didn't create an entire fantasy, which would be easy to be undermined by systematic questioning. What she did was take little elements of what in fact was true.
I remember now why I didn't pursue Heather. Because things pointed to Heather being a lesbian.
A what?
A lesbian. But I didn't want the other kids exposed to that.
Are you a lesbian?
No.
In fact, many female witnesses would later testify to having been the victim of violent sexual assaults by Rose.
At that stage, there was nothing to suggest she was lying, and it didn't make me think that something terrible had happened to Heather and that she was no longer alive.
Fred, on remand for the alleged rape of the 13-year-old, told his children when they visited him that their sister Heather had already been to see him.
Oh no, she's doing very nicely. Working as a prostitute, making loads of money, selling her body.
In fact, Heather's dismembered body lay buried beneath the patio at 25 Cromwell Street. Rose was allowed home, but with her children in care because of the abuse case, she was stressed and lonely. On the 13th of August, a week after the raid, she took an overdose of pills and needed to have her stomach pumped. Her behaviour became increasingly strange. She'd wander around Gloucester with her shopping in a pram.
Rose, by this stage, is approaching 40. She's a middle-aged lady, rather heavy-set, dowdy-looking, but there's something really rather odd about her appearance. She tends to dress as a schoolgirl. She wears these white schoolgirl socks, but she dresses in other ways of somebody who's really a child.
Rose had actually adopted this new role. She went from being the dominant aggressor in the most horrific killing scenes to being a victim of the situation and someone who could never be the perpetrator of such sadistic violence, retreating into childhood safety and security.
She'd strip and gorge on chocolate eclairs whilst watching children's cartoons. As the trial for the assault on the 13-year-old loomed, the stress and separation rekindled the relationship between Fred and Rose.
Hello, my darling. How are you? Oh, I'm fine.
On the 7th of June, 1993, the trial for the abuse of the 13-year-old opened at Gloucester Magistrates' Court.
Fred was charged with 3 counts of rape and buggery against an underage child, and Rose was charged with inciting rape and with child cruelty.
But before the jury could be sworn in, the 13-year-old girl decided not to testify, and the case collapsed. Fred and Rose's children remained in care, but they were free to go home.
Welcome home.
They had gotten away with it yet again, and this will have reaffirmed their ideas that they were pretty much invulnerable, so long as they stuck together.
With the case dismissed, the police no longer had need of the 99 porn videos seized from Cromwell Street. They were granted permission by Rose to destroy them, a move which later drew criticism.
Some of those videos might have contained images of some of the young women that the Wests had killed.
Would some of that video material have had links with what we found in terms of the victims? Then there's a possibility of that. But that's hindsight. The police can't keep things just in case something might happen in the future.
But although the case against the Wests was officially closed, one officer refused to stop investigating. Detective Constable Hazel Savage found out that a social worker had overheard an unusual exchange between the West children, who were still in care.
Get off! You'll get it in a minute.
Get off! Give us...
Give me the pen or I'll tell Mum and you'll end up under the patio like Heather.
The conversation about Heather being under the patio and the fact that Heather had disappeared without trace started to ring some alarm bells.
Hazel Savage begins to push to have a full-blown search done of Cromwell Street.
We need to dig up the garden.
Senior officers refused.
I can understand that there would have been some resistance.
We'll be a laughingstock.
You've got to convince a magistrate that this is not just a fishing expedition.
But 6 months later, one of the children said something to a social worker that could no longer be ignored.
Dad says we're not really allowed to talk about it, because if we do, we'll get murdered and put under the patio like Heather.
This time, Hazel Savage was back. 8 months after the rape trial collapsed, police arrived at 25 Cromwell Street with a search warrant. They had no idea 9 bodies lay buried and that they were about to be at the centre of an international media storm.
Rose West. Got a warrant here.
We were searching for the remains of Heather, and as far as we were aware, that was it.
The West's 21-year-old daughter was in the house.
You're flipping joking. Call her Dad! You're not coming in!
Fred was at work, half an hour away.
They showed you the warrant? Right. I'll be right there.
In the garden, police began their excavation. But Fred didn't turn up for another 4 hours when the police diggers had already left for the day.
I'm sure that Fred would not be finishing off a little job at work under these circumstances. Probably he went immediately to try and hide evidence external to Cromwell Street.
The next day, the diggers were back.
And this is work that Fred has done all his life. It's manual work, digging a hole. And he knows exactly where Heather is buried, and he knows where the other victims are buried. So he knows that it's not going to be long until they start uncovering human remains. And so he comes to a rather big decision.
You go asking for my mother?
Rose.
You've got nothing to do with my mother,
Rose,
Father.
hey, calm
Don't
down.
you go asking. It's an invasion of my privacy. It's an invasion of my privacy.
Just have a quiet word with Rose now, all right?
Fred, with a naive view of his prospects, made a pact with Rose.
They have an agreement that he will take the blame, she will continue to visit him, they will stay together. He believes he'll do just 12 years or so in prison.
All right. Take me away.
Fred put on one last show of innocence.
I've never done it!
Just get in the car.
I've never done it!
Just get in the car, Fred.
Did not kill my daughter. They're trying to say I killed her. You didn't do it. All right. I did it. I killed Heather.
Good afternoon, Mr. West.
That night, the story hit the screens.
Series of brutal murders.
Watching the TV news was Caroline Owens. 22 years earlier, she'd been the West's nanny.
It said a man in Gloucester had been arrested on suspicion of his daughter being buried under the patio in the garden, and then it said his name. I already knew it was going to say his name, but it said his name.
Age 17, she'd been abducted and subjected to a 12-hour sexual ordeal by Fred and by Rose, who was then 19.
You stupid little bitch! We're gonna bury you under the paving stones of Gloucester!
We've got hundreds of girls down there. The police didn't find them and they won't find you!
I just broke down. It was just like... It was just like he'd come back again. And the girl that was killed was Little Heather. It's Little Heather. To me, she was 2. She was still 2 in my mind.
Others were stunned by the arrest.
I can remember on that night turning the TV on here at home. There were these neighbours saying, They've got it all wrong. Fred and Rose, wonderful. Really, they're family people.
Always the kind of guy who would say, come on in, you know, I'll sit up a cup of tea now.
Was there anything unusual about the house?
Nothing unusual, just a lot of kids.
Every serial killer that's going to be able to continue killing for any length of time is going to be able to present a very respectable public face, which will be at some odds with the private reality to that public face.
It was the start of what quickly became a media frenzy.
The media interest in this case was global. This was a crime that was of great public interest.
Fred's brother Doug and his family were suddenly in the spotlight.
That was just like an explosion. It's like when you see a movie and they're stood still and everything's moving around them. That's what it was like. Just frozen.
At that particular time, I could have went and lived on an island on my own. But you can't, because I got responsibilities. I got work responsibilities and family responsibilities.
The depths of the West's depravity were about to be revealed. But if Fred thought he and Rose would stick together, she had other ideas. He was going to be the fall guy, and she'd do all in her power to save her skin. Fred West was taken to Gloucester Police Headquarters for questioning after he confessed to the murder of his 16-year-old daughter, Heather. From the start, he didn't seem to grasp the seriousness of what was happening.
Oh, there was no controlling her, Heather. She was the right one. You ain't never seen nothing like her. Never no underwear. Always wore them low-cut tops. Showing off her titties, eh? She was a right one.
It was all very chilling. Fred talked as though everything was absolutely normal.
I never killed her intentionally. It wasn't murder.
As a result of what you did, she died.
Yeah. That's the bad part.
Fred gives a confession regarding the death of Heather, which is a story part fantasy, part truth, perhaps.
And the body?
Cut her up like, put her in a bin.
And what about the clothes?
In black bin bags, left them outside the vets. It was bin day.
But he stuck to his pact with Rose, that he'd take the blame.
Nothing to do with her. She don't know nothing about it.
He agreed to show police where Heather was buried. He knew they were close to discovering 2 other bodies in the garden.
Dig down about 4 foot and you'll find her.
Where exactly?
There! No need to go messing up the old blooming garden.
He seems to think that he can get away with Heather being found without them finding the others, which doesn't seem very logical in retrospect, but that seems to be the way his mind was working.
Rose had no idea Fred had confessed, so detectives could set their trap.
Tell me about Heather's disappearance.
Once a child cuts you off, there's not a great deal you can do about it.
When was she last in touch?
She went to visit Fred in the bail hostel. He said she looked rough. I just hope she's out there somewhere in the big bad world.
We should inform you there's been a development. Fred has confessed to murdering Heather.
That drew a huge and shocked gasp from Rose, and she was disturbed and trembling at that point. It was probably one of the most emotional points that I witnessed with Rose in the whole inquiry.
Rose's strategy now became clear. For Fred, the pact was about protecting Rose and one day resuming life together. But Rose simply threw him to the wolves.
So you know where she is?
He's told us where she is.
So she's dead, is she?
We have reason to believe you're involved.
It's a lie. I tell you, if I ever get my hands on Fred, he's a dead man.
Her enmity, venom, turned to Fred, And that was the narrative right the way through. And Fred was the enemy. Fred was the betrayer. Fred was this evil person who'd manipulated and exploited her and killed her daughter.
Police dug where Fred had indicated.
We've got something.
They found one bone fragment they thought might be human. Then they spotted a much bigger object.
And they bring in Professor Bernard Knight, who's a Home Office pathologist. He's perhaps the most eminent pathologist in the country.
Yes, it's a human thigh bone.
I remember looking down into what is essentially a grave and seeing skeletal remains. And I remember in particular seeing black hair.
Her remains indicated Heather had been murdered and dismembered in a frenzy. 7 years earlier, Heather had been killed when she was just 16 years old, because Fred and Rose feared she was about to tell people what had been going on in the house. Professor Knight examined the other bone fragment found earlier.
Definitely human. Definitely not the girl in the hall. You've got some more digging to do.
Police began to realize they were dealing with multiple murders. That day, they interviewed Caroline Owens, the former nanny who'd been threatened with being killed and buried.
That night it came on the news that they'd found remains. But it was 3 lots. Well, it was at least 2 lots. They'd found 3 legs. So, it was all coming true. But the worst thing was when I realised how soon. Sorry.
In 1972, after her 12-hour torture and rape ordeal, Caroline had dropped a rape charge against the Wests. They were only found guilty and fined £100 for indecent assault.
The worst thing was when they started naming some of the victims they discovered. I realised they started killing 3 months after my court case in 72. And in the following 9 months they killed 3 girls. And to my mind, if I'd pushed the rape charge, they would have been alive.
The evidence that we were able to gain from the statements made by Caroline Owens were fundamental to the investigation.
Caroline's testimony clearly implicated Rose. Police questioned Fred about the assault on Caroline, and the pact to shield Rose quickly began to crumble.
Done it to test out Rose, like. To see if they'd have lesbian sex together.
That's what you were hoping for?
Bit of bondage.
And murder?
Probably. Could have gotten that far.
Police confronted Rose with the discovery of Heather's body.
Well, we found her in a grave in your garden.
There was a gasp of shock, and Rose remained in I'd say, a fairly brittle and distressed state from then on in.
Come. Would you be surprised if we told you there was a second body?
Oh, this is all getting too much!
Police also told Fred they'd found a second body. Concerned about his intellect, they'd appointed an appropriate adult under the Mental Health Act to look after his welfare and to be an independent witness.
Obviously better confess then. Not 1 extra body, but 2. Shirley Robinson. She was a lesbian, like, but she was pregnant with my baby. And Shirley's mate.
Named?
Dunno. Talking a long time ago. She's buried by the bathroom.
He's seen sense, Rose. Told us everything.
They're still around if you do the same as him.
There's something wrong with that bloke altogether.
Rose was arrested for the 2 murders, but allowed home on bail. Fred was charged with murdering Heather. He agreed to show where the 2 further victims were buried, but the police were increasingly concerned about his grip on reality.
Bloody hell do you think you're doing? What's the point in all this, eh? Told you I'd tell you where to dig. Right, you're putting all this back exactly as you found it. Do you hear me?
The first body from the West's many sex killings was found that afternoon. 16-year-old Alison Chambers died in 1979. Around her decapitated skull, the purple belt they'd used to bind her was still in place. 4 hours later, police found Shirley Robinson. She lived in a ménage à trois with Fred and Rose, but her pregnancy had been her death sentence. Next to Shirley's dismembered body lay the skeleton of her unborn child. Police suspected this wasn't the end of it, and they decided to take the house apart in the search for bodies.
Once the police are digging up the inside of Cromwell Street, so I think for the first time Fred appreciated that the game was largely up.
Fred came to a dramatic decision. He instructed his solicitor he wanted to make a fresh confession.
I wrote a statement, which was extremely brief, to hand in to the police.
I get a phone call to say, we've just had this note from Fred's solicitor to say that I want to confess to the murders of an additional 9 approximately.
The problem that I had was he couldn't remember how many he was accepting responsibility for.
We didn't know where these bodies were, we didn't know who they were. We knew we got a big case because the human remains were already recovered, but to have this sort of scale, gave it a different dimension.
Fred was brought to the cellar to mark out the graves. His behaviour was becoming even stranger.
They're swirling all around me. My girls.
He believed the girls had been in such pain during their torture, it had been merciful for him to murder them.
To Fred, he had a relationship in his head with each of these girls, and they were looking down on him from heaven and were thanking him for what he'd done, because in his head, he'd done them a favour.
It took 5 days to recover the bodies.
It was very claustrophobic down there, quite damp as I recall, and cold, and a very forbidding place really. The excavations were painstaking. It was like archaeology. These bodies had been in there for some time, but we knew that we had to take them out literally piece by piece.
As digging continued, Fred agreed to show police 2 more graves near Much Marcle. He said his first wife Rena was buried in one, and his 16-year-old lover Anna McFall, who'd been pregnant with his child when she died, was buried in the field next door, but he couldn't identify the exact spot.
Here maybe?
There.
Or here maybe?
Where?
Different though. It's all changed, hasn't it?
Part of the field that had been re-landscaped, and soil had been put in to level the field out.
We're about here.
Because we excavated a hole as big as an Olympic-sized swimming pool. And we couldn't just get a big digger in there because we were looking for tiny fragments of bones. So it had to be excavated literally by hand.
It took 13 days to find Rena. Her dismembered body was next to a child's plastic boomerang, possibly used to abuse her during the killing. She was murdered because she came looking for her 8-year-old daughter Charmaine in 1971. Fred now became a suspect over the child's disappearance, but his brother Doug knew the dates when Charmaine was likely to have died proved Fred wasn't responsible.
The police was on about him killing Charmaine. I said to him, well, do you want to go back and check the records then?
Doug told police that when Charmaine went missing in June 1971, Fred was in prison.
I said, he couldn't have killed her, could he?
On the 5th of May, 1994, police recovered Charmaine's body behind the West's former home on Midland Road in Gloucester. Rose, then 17, and left looking after the children on her own, had written to Fred in jail, saying how stressful she found it dealing with Charmaine. Police needed to prove she'd done the killing. They found a photo showing a gap where Charmaine had lost milk teeth. The recovered skull showed that by the time she died, Charmaine's teeth had grown a little.
We had a brilliant forensic dentist, and he was able, looking at the skull of Charmaine and the photograph, and superimposing it, to say that Charmaine died within 5 or 6 weeks from the date of the photograph.
That placed 8-year-old Charmaine's death squarely in the time Fred was in jail.
It meant that Charmaine was at home on her own with Rose, and that was the evidence that led to her conviction.
One by one, other bodies were recovered from the house. Fred told police he couldn't remember the names of many.
If you find human remains and you have no idea who they are, the task of identifying those remains is immense.
Fred said all he knew was that many had been hitchhikers or runaways. It took several weeks to identify them all. The first to be found was 21-year-old Swiss student Theresa Siegenthaler, abducted while hitchhiking. She was gagged, bound and raped before being murdered. Next was Shirley Hubbard, a 15-year-old who'd been in care. Then Lucy Partington, a 21-year-old university student. Juanita Mott, an 18-year-old who'd been a lodger in the house. Linda Goff, a 19-year-old nanny. And finally, a 15-year-old girl in care called Carol Ann Cooper. Back in the field, it took 2 months to find Anna McFall. Curled beside her was the fetus of Fred's unborn child. Rose was now in custody. Like Fred, she was charged with murder and rape as each victim was identified.
The idea that she was going to get away completely started to disappear. The doors were closing in on Rose.
Her last hope was to distance herself as much as possible from Fred and blame him. She was about to deliver a lethal blow to one of the most notorious serial killing partnerships in history.
She's brighter than Fred. She's got more sense of self-preservation.
By June 1994, Fred had been charged with 11 murders, Rose with 9. Fred was still under the illusion they could get through this together. On the 30th of June, he was brought to court to be remanded in custody and to see Rose for the first time in 3 months.
I have a very vivid memory of this, which has stuck with me ever since and was a very powerful moment for me personally covering the story. She very obviously snubbed him. To my mind, this is an absolutely key point in the whole story.
All rise.
She's brighter than Fred. She's got more sense of self-preservation. She wants to be acquitted at trial. And her method is to say it was all Fred, it wasn't me, I didn't know anything about it. And in fact, the man makes me feel sick.
It's been speculated that Rose was more psychopathic than Fred, in that she abrogated all responsibility and put that onto Fred, which is obviously much more psychopathic than Fred feeling empathy for her and not wanting her to go to prison.
Take them down.
Rose. Rosie.
Over the next 6 months, all the bodies were identified, and in December, the Wests were back in court. Fred was charged with 12 murders, Rose with 10. This time, he'd been warned Rose didn't want to speak to him.
Fred is a psychopath, but with some kind of broken heart. It appears that now this bond's been severed.
In his cell at Winston Green Prison, Fred decided he couldn't live without Rose.
To Rose West, Happy New Year, darling.
And even then, he's writing her a love letter, a poem, saying, "Come to me," which I believe is saying, "Kill yourself too, we'll be together."
Oh, my love, Fred West. Oh, my love, forever and ever.
But Rose has no intention. She's going to go on with her life alone. She's long since outgrown Fred. And now this is the end for her as far as she's concerned.
On New Year's morning 1995, a prison warder found Fred hanging in his cell.
I was absolutely gutted. I couldn't believe that they'd allowed him to do it. My first thoughts was, she'll get off now. I thought Rose would get off.
Catherine Halliday, a former lover of Fred and Rose, who believes she nearly became a victim, was preparing to give evidence at trial.
I was angry when I found out about Fred topping himself, because he'd taken the coward's way out. He wasn't going to get his bit of just reward.
When you heard that he had hung himself, what did you think?
He was a fool to do it. He took the easy way out, didn't he?
I saw my dad's face when he got the phone call, and it broke my heart. Because no matter what he did, he was still his brother. And he never got a chance to talk to him. He never got a chance to find out why or ask him anything.
On the 3rd of October 1995, Rose's trial opened at Winchester Crown Court. She was charged with 10 murders, 2 rapes and 2 indecent assaults. A stream of witnesses, including Rose's mother Daisy and Fred's daughter Anne-Marie, gave evidence against her. Catherine Halliday described how Rose's sadistic sex sessions had gone too far.
It wasn't easy in court because she just stared through me. And I'm very, very much aware of her staring through me, coldly, icily staring through me.
The jury was shown gruesome evidence of the way one of Fred and Rose's victims had been tortured.
When her skull was found, the kind of encasing that went round her head was still there. Even Rose, actually, who was shown the exhibit, blanched.
Caroline Owens, the West's former nanny, described her ordeal in detail.
For the first time in my lifetime, I think, felt self-respect. Felt like I'd done something. I went in there to get justice for the girls that didn't make it. And I helped towards that.
Rose herself gave evidence.
That was, I think, a mistake, because she was a very bad witness.
I hated him. I didn't see the man I'd known all those years. I saw a walking figure of evil. And I know it might sound daft, but I saw him with horns and a satanic grin.
The jury didn't believe her, and they weren't swayed by defense complaints the case was compromised because many witnesses had sold their stories. They returned 10 unanimous verdicts of guilty.
The indictment seemed to go on for forever almost. I was watching Rose throughout, and there was absolutely no emotion at all on her face. It was just absolutely stone face.
On the 22nd of November 1995, Rose West was sentenced to life imprisonment. The judge recommended she never be released.
She should have known. She took life. She should lose hers.
And people say, how do you feel about the victims' families? Well, hello, it's nice to meet you, because I am one of the victims' families. I lost 2 cousins, and when I say my name, people look at me like I am evil. And I don't want to hurt anybody. I just want everyone to leave my family in peace.
They knew what they were doing, they knew what they were going to do, and they would have carried on, and make no mistake about that. And I, for one, just hope she rots in hell, in prison. I do. I hope she never ever gets out, because she's as wicked as he is. They were both as bad as one another.
Next tonight on Channel 5, Can't Pay will take it away.